Dear class of Education and Sustainability, this is our second PowerPoint presentation, and today I will be presenting about sustainability, vocational education, and work. Do you remember those years in high school, at least for those of you who grew up in the US, when you had to take home economics and shop class? And there, in those classes, you learned basic skills such as sewing, cooking, woodwork, and metalwork. In my own high school days, back in Colombia, which I took in the early 1980s, our vocational education classes consisted of two things, at least in that school. One was to learn how to type in a typewriter. This is before the age of computers. And the other was to learn how to write in shorthand, also called stenography. I must say that today I don't remember either of these skills. For typewriting, I still use four fingers, and for stenography, there are only maybe two symbols that I still remember. But the problem was not with the teachers or with the courses, they were actually with me. I was not a very dedicated student. But in any case, this is what I want to talk to you about this wonderful form of education that I will call here vocational education, but that has also been called technical and vocational education, TVE, productive education, work education, technology education, and in the US, at least in the last decade or so, the more common term is career and technical education. Supporters of CTE, of career and technical education, say that CTE is not vocational education, that it's actually a far cry from what existed in the past. And I agree with them. Vocational education programs today offer a wide variety of possibilities that didn't exist previously in fields like engineering, health, business, environment, law enforcement, cosmetology, agriculture and husbandry, and so on. You can actually go to the website of JTED in this case, and you will find all kinds of very interesting vocational possibilities. Nonetheless, I like to keep the term vocational simply because it refers to a long standing tradition of engaging in work that is important to the person, something akin to a calling. Here in the state of Arizona, and I believe in other states as well, we have created something called JTEDs, which are Joint Technical Education Districts. These are not high school per se, these are centers that receive students from all types of high schools, both private and public, and even students who have been homeschooled, and they can attend there and obtain courses in vocational education. These are not degree granting institutions, but they have been created because it's much easier for high schools to save money this way. It's actually a great idea because instead of each high school having their own vocational education program, which can be extremely expensive because of the cost of the machinery, instead they have joined forces and created several centers, and these exist throughout the state. So that's what we have in Arizona, and it's a relatively new thing. It's perhaps of the last 5 years or so. Before we proceed, I think it's important to ask ourselves what is technical and vocational education? And the more conventional definition has been it's an organized educational program that prepares youth for the world of work. But I want to offer an alternative definition. For this alternative definition, I want to offer to you the following, that vocational and technical education is an organized educational program that promotes a sense of empowerment, a stronger sense of community, and protection for the natural environment. Now, here I want to capture an idea adapted from the work of the great American educator and philosopher John Dewey. And he wrote, "The goal of production is to produce not commodities, but free people in harmony with nature." Actually, the original quote only reads that the goal of production is to produce not commodities, but free people. But given his openness to new ideas, I'd like to think that John Dewey would agree with me if I were to add to his famous quote, in harmony with nature. Isn't that a powerful quote? I love this quote because for me it summarizes essentially what vocational education ought to be. Now, this alternative definition is what I hope vocational education ought to be. But what is the current situation of TVE? TVE has generally been perceived as a less prestigious form of education relative to general academic education, in great part because it was created to serve youth from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, and because the pecuniary and status rewards derived from it have been, especially in developing countries, lower than those for graduates of the academic strand. In terms of the role it has played pretty much in most countries, in overdeveloped, less developed, and adequately developed countries, and here I'm trying to use a more accurate terminology for countries, TVE has sought to train students to produce goods and services that maximize economic growth while yielding individual benefits, which are measured by salary earnings and occupational opportunities. The conventional discourse and policies surrounding TVE have focused mostly on increasing personal and social rates of return, and seldom have they sought to present a critical analysis of the social relations inside TVE programs, things related to power differences around sociological categories such as race, ethnicity, gender, physical ability, or sexual orientation, and much less certainly on the social or environmental consequences of the production of the goods and services. Despite this reality, in the last 2 decades, there has been counter discourses related to TVE that have arisen from different parts of the world that have focused on the intersection between economic, environmental, and social sustainability. Some of this work has been supported by UNIVOC, which is the International Center for Technical and Vocational Education and Training, which is the United Nations entity, or more specifically, the UNESCO entity in charge of technical and vocational education. UNIVOC, the headquarters, are based in Bonn, Germany. So let's take a look at each one of the three dimensions of sustainability. I will not include so much the cultural one, but I will focus on the economic, the environmental, and the social sustainability dimensions as they relate to TVE. In terms of economic sustainability, this dimension promotes economic literacy, which is basically how to ensure that a business remains alive over the long term, in tandem with sustainable production, which is basically how to provide goods and services that address basic human needs and offer a better quality of life, while being accountable for social and environmental costs of these same goods and services. And this is tied to a form of development that seeks to support social and environmental well being. A related issue is what authors like Joe Kinkalo have called a critical pedagogy of work. Today, vocational education is overwhelmingly subordinated to the economic imperatives of national and transnational capitalism, but not to the moral and ethical dimensions of a good life. Teaching any student, but especially poor students, to fit blindly into industrial and post industrial capitalism is akin to ensuring that exploitation and unfair labor practices continue. Now, the sheer knowledge will not prevent the actual practice, but at the very least, they will be equipped to understand that um, to understand ways in which these obstacles could be overcome. A critical pedagogy work is not against acquiring solid technical skills, but at the same time, it stresses the importance of engaging students in an emancipatory dialogue in which they can talk freely about expectations, fears, and frustrations regarding the worlds of education and work. It also introduces them to the history of work and labor, to the struggles of unions and other worker movements, and to alternative economic systems of development, such as supporting bioregional economies through cooperatives as a more enlightened possibility. We have talked about some of these in previous sessions. The second leg of the stool is environmental sustainability. This dimension calls for the conservation of natural resources and for a use that minimizes waste and pollution by engaging in such tools as the life cycle analysis of all products and services. At the same time, it stresses a new set of attitudes, skills, and values that cultivate a respect for the earth in all its diversity and a sense of care for the earth's community in a way that secures its bounty and beauty for present and future generations. As you might have detected, a lot of this language actually comes from the Brundtland Report of 1987, and UNESCO and many folks in the technical and vocational education world have been influenced by that language. But at the same time, this dimension of environmental sustainability, it includes also a decolonial aspect in that it hopes that vocational education will serve as a powerful strategy for developing an ethic of care and for providing practical skills needed to regenerate human and natural communities, but answers that derive from the local communities themselves and not those imposed from European metropolis or those of from the United States. And the third leg of the stool is social sustainability. This dimension advocates first and foremost poverty alleviation, which is of course an emphasis on the creation of vocational education programs. And here the emphasis would be on access to basic needs such as clean water, air, and soil, decent housing, universal health care, and dignified work, among other things. It also calls for respect for cultural diversity, including the inclusion of groups that have historically been marginalized. It calls for gender equality, including protection from discrimination and sexual harassment. And it pushes for fair and safe working conditions inside the workplace. And vocational education serves as a foundation for an education that breaks down the dualisms of contemporary education in a way similar to what I discussed in the previous presentation on physical education and physical activity. So, here, some of these dualisms are the separation of mind from body, theory from practice, individuals from collectivity, school from community, and social groups from natural systems. So, the hope, the expectation, is that vocational education will be able to address some of these issues. Here are some of the examples of goods and services that progressive and sustainable vocational programs could undertake. And here you can look at the list yourself. And as you might have surmised from the presentation so far, the issue is not only the good and the service that is actually provided, but it's also important to open the black box of vocational education to see what happens inside of it in terms of our groups that have been historically marginalized treated in a dignified fashion. Are the working conditions of workers safe and fair? Are they being paid, if in case they are being paid or given credit or so on, in ways that are fair to all the folks involved? So all of these are considerations that need to be considered. Considerations that need to be considered. That's a little bit redundant. But in any case, I think you get the gist of what I'm saying in terms of not just the product and the service that is being provided, but also how it's being done and who is doing it and under what conditions. To understand the full potential that vocational education could play today, it is useful to go back a little bit in history and to explore the ideas of earlier writers who connected manual labor to social change and justice. In pre modern societies, vocational skills were passed on to children and youth by more competent adults, and this was done for economic preparation. But the main focus were the needs of the person, not those of the economic system. And that's part of the problem that we have today. So I think it's important to go back a little bit in history, all the way to the end of, or the second half of the 18th century, and start focusing on the works of people like Jean Jacques Rousseau, then in the 19th century on Karl Marx, and then at the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century, the work of John Dewey. Three influential writers who laid the foundation for understanding the intersection between vocational education and individual and community well being. Rousseau was one of the earliest Western pedagogues to provide a full fledged exposition of the importance of promoting manual work among youth to reduce social prejudices and to enhance egalitarianism. In the third book of his well known Emile, published in 1762, he wrote about the need to strive for equality. And he wrote, "A rich man doesn't have a bigger stomach than a poor man, and doesn't digest better than him. The master doesn't have longer or stronger arms than his slave. A respected man is not more important than someone from the masses. And ultimately, the needs of them all are the same, and so should be the means to satisfy them." By this quote, he was advocating for the importance of equality, an idea that is very much a part of the Enlightenment of the second half of the 18th century. And equally important for Rousseau were skills that brought people closer to nature, especially in the case of agriculture, which, in his opinion, it was the most honest, the most useful, and the most noble of all activities. Rousseau's ideas directly and indirectly influenced those of the utopian socialists, people like Saint Simon, people like Fourier, or Robert Owen, the founder of the modern cooperative movement. And these people, in turn, influenced the work of Karl Marx. Although Marx's writings on education were scant, his ideas did influence the theory and practice of vocational education. He was particularly impressed by the work of Robert Owen. Robert Owen was a Welsh, and he founded in Scotland the new Lanark colony factory. And in fact, he actually came to the US and founded another colony here called New Harmony, which were basically cooperative movements, both of these. New Harmony didn't last very long. There were a lot of internal problems. But nonetheless, these experiments greatly influenced people at the time, including someone like Karl Marx. So he wrote in in Das Kapital, from the factory system budded, as Robert Owen has shown us in great detail, the germ of the education of the future, an education that will, in the case of every child over a given age, combine productive labor with instruction and gymnastics, not only as one of the methods of adding to the efficiency of social production, but as the only method of producing fully developed human beings. Let me repeat that last part of the quote, but as the only method of producing fully developed human beings. I mean, quite an extraordinary assertion he's making here, something that actually will influence somebody like John Dewey. Marx's idea that people could transform themselves by using work to alter the social and natural world around them influenced John Dewey. While John Dewey was frequently critical of Marxism and state socialism, he nonetheless employed Marxian concepts in his analysis and later on in his career defended democratic socialism as a viable alternative to the excesses of capitalism. Although Dewey did not privilege social class as an organizing category and principle, as Marx did, he did believe that the intimate connection that existed between humans and their occupations in pre industrial societies had been lost under the capitalist mode of production. Yeah, he also, like Marx, saw work as a means of fulfilling one's humanness. As Dewey wrote in one of his earlier books, School and Society, published in 1899, he wrote that the aim of work is not the economic value of the products, but the development of social power and insight. Dewey also expanded on Marx's economic critique of the pernicious effects of the dualisms of modernity, the separation of mind from body, theory from practice, individuals from collectivity, and school from community. By placing occupations at the heart of the curriculum, Dewey believed that manual work could become a key mechanism for connecting schools to the larger social life of the community. And here's the quote that is very similar to the one I just read previously from School and Society. This one is actually from his more famous book, Democracy and Education, published in 1916, when he wrote that an occupation is the only thing that balances the distinctive capacity of an individual with a social service. As you can see, this is similar to the previous quote from Marx. It is important to note that Dewey's conception of occupational training was different from the more narrow vocational education that reinforces and perpetuates class divisions. By occupations, he didn't mean particular jobs or even training, but he actually meant um, he understood occupations as life activities that stroke a balance between the intellectual and practical aspects of existence. So when he talked about somebody becoming a cook, he was not so much interested in the idea of becoming a professional chef, but more broadly, he believed in the socially useful activity that integrated the various disciplines in pro of the individual and the collectivity. Now, that's in terms of some of the main theoreticians behind vocational education. It should be said that in the work of John Dewey, he was able to translate some of the theory into practice through his laboratory school, which he founded at the end of the 19th century at the University of Chicago, a school that still exists today. Now, what about larger movements around the world? Some of the people that have inspired me and millions of others were the work and practice of Célestin Freinet in France, who was a contemporary of Dewey, and who in the US he has been called the French Dewey. It should also be said that in France, Dewey is considered the American Freinet. Also in the Soviet Union, the work done by Anton Makarenko the work in Botswana by the Botswana brigades. People who led that were folks like Patrick van Rensburg. In Sri Lanka, we find the Sarvodaya Shramadana movement, founded by A.T. Ariyaratne, and in Cuba, the schools to the countryside, which started in the 1960s at the beginning of the Cuban Revolution. In Northern Europe, and especially Scandinavian countries and Germany and Holland, there's a well established tradition of combining work education with personal and communal well being. So clearly, there are examples of large scale vocational movements, some more successful than others around the world. Now, it should also be said that despite these vital efforts, the main goal of vocational education in most countries today continues to be mere functional empowerment. That is, to instill in students the technical and human relation skills they need to fulfill their responsibilities in future employment. Now, while requiring and acquiring these skills is undoubtedly beneficial, they should not be obtained at the expense of other vital skills, such as the necessary language, conceptual knowledge, and political skills to awaken in students their moral, social, and environmental responsibilities. And I want to end this presentation by telling you a little bit about the work of Albert Camus and a couple of his quotes that I find incredibly inspiring. He was a French Algerian author who received the Nobel Literature Prize in 1957. He died a few years later in his early 40s. And in his work, he identified the problems of what he considered to be the absurd of the human condition. And he would say things like, and here, please be kind enough to indulge me in practicing my French. He wrote in one of his newspaper columns, Il n'est pas de punition plus terrible que le travail inutile et sans espoir, which translates, there's no punishment more severe than work that is useless and without hope. And in a similar vein, he wrote this other quote that I want to share with you. Sans travail, tout est vie pourrie, mais sous un travail sans âme, la vie étouffe et meurt. Without work, all life goes rotten, but when work is soulless, life stifles and dies. And just to finish on a lighter note related to work, I love the songs of Argentinian singer Facundo Cabral, who died a few years ago. Actually, died very tragically. But anyway, he was always a jokester, and one of his famous jokes was, "Mira si será malo el trabajo que deben pagarte para que lo haga. Look how bad work must be that you have to get paid to do it." Well, that's it, my dear friends. We will be in touch until next week. Bye bye.